Welcome, teacher friend. I'm Lori.
And I'm Melissa.
We are two literacy educators in Baltimore. We want the best for all kids, and we know you do too.
Our district recently adopted a new literacy curriculum, which meant a lot of change for everyone. Lori and I can't wait to keep learning about literacy with you today.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Melissa and Lori Love Literacy Podcast. We are here with a special episode of just Lori and Melissa talking about a book. So welcome, Melissa.
You're welcome. Yeah, it's just us today.
I know.
It's kind of like our Facebook Live, but it's not live. It's just us.
I'm excited because we're piloting this really fun idea that we have about a book talk that then we have a complimentary podcast with the authors of the book. But we thought there are so many busy educators out there who may not be able to read the book before listening to the podcast, or maybe they want to read it after. So we thought we'd give them just enough to kind of whet their appetite and get excited for the book and be able to more deeply understand the podcast with the authors.
Absolutely. It reminds me of our podcast with Jen David Lang that we did, the Mastermind, and how she does those like summaries for the really busy educators.
In writing, but we're doing it now on a podcast.
Yeah. And I hope it's helpful for people who, want to just like get a little context before we actually talk to the authors.
Mm-hmm. We'd love to hear. So let us know.
Yeah.
Jump in our Facebook Lives. Let us know if it's helpful.
We'll keep doing it if it's helpful.
Exactly. Well,
right.
I'm excited for today because we're going to be talking about your specialty here, secondary readers.
Secondary, of course, my favorite. Well, I mean, you started there too, so
yeah. But then I spent the majority of my time not in. I was like, oh my gosh, this place is a mess.
No, thank you.
I got to figure out what's going on. Why are kids coming to high school not being able to read?
Well, our book tells us a little bit.
What we can do about it.
Yeah. So, did we say the title of the book yet? I don't think we did.
We did not.
All right. So the title of our book that we'll be talking about, and then to the authors on our podcast on Friday, is Thinking Reading: What Every Secondary Teacher Needs to Know About Reading, with James and Diane Murphy.
Yep. So we'll be talking to James and Diane, and the title of their podcast coming out will be titled Teaching Secondary Reading with Authors of Thinking Reading. So a lot of reading, but
that's what we're all about.
That's what we're here for. So you're in the right spot.
All right. So, I mean, they really do try and answer that question that you asked, Lori. But it's like, well, not really how did this happen, but more so, what do I do? Right? I'm a teacher, a secondary teacher. I have students who are coming to me and they're not reading on grade level. What do I do?
Yeah.
So this book is helpful in that way, and we'll talk a little bit about it, right?
Absolutely. But I think we should start with a story that we're going to reference a bit in the podcast with them. It's from chapter 1, and chapter 1 is titled Why Every Teacher Needs to Know About Reading, which I think is really helpful, especially when we're thinking about secondary teachers who may not have received all the we now know all teachers may not have received instruction that they need, but especially our secondary teachers who
absolutely,
have struggling readers coming to them, but did not receive likely any training on what to do. So,
yeah, I highlighted with a lot of highlighter every teacher,
every
single teacher, because it does affect every teacher.
Yep. But so we're going to share this little story that I think sets the stage for the book and for our podcast. So, Melissa, you want to start us off?
Absolutely.
I feel like we need music, like little interlude before we do a story, but maybe we can have.
I feel like there is a fancy way to do that on here, but I have no idea how to do it.
We'll work on that for our phase 2 book club.
Yes. Reading music. All right. Here it is for real.
Okay.
After 10 years of education, Andrew was highly disruptive in lessons and was on the brink of exclusion from his secondary school. He was also reading at the level of a 6.5-year-old. His levels of frustration were apparent when, asked to complete a computer-based test, he broke the mouse. He was not impressed by the thought of attending yet another reading intervention.
Warmth, firmness, and the carrot of reading a book on football won him over, at least for the present. Andrew was smart. He had no problem with comprehension, but learning to decode the words on the page was a different matter. By his second lesson, Andrew could see that he was making progress, and we had buy-in.
It wasn't always an easy road. Andrew had a reputation to protect with his friends and was not always the ideal student, but he made 9 years progress in 13 months, gained 5 A through C grades in his GCSEs, and became a student leader in the 6th form. At the time of writing, he is completing his 3rd year in university. Not bad for a boy who couldn't read.
Imagine how different his schooling would have been if he had been taught differently from an earlier age. How much do teachers need to know about reading, and why does it matter? All right, that's great. Good questions here.
We should probably just, as I was reading it, realize we should tell our listeners that they're based in England.
Yeah.
And so some of these, the football reference, talking about soccer, the GCSEs are their exams.
Yes, I was going to say, I don't know what GCSE stands for, but it's clearly an exam.
I forget what it stands for, too.
Yeah.
I did live there for 3 months, 6 months, however long you're there when you study abroad.
Ooh, that's exciting. I didn't know that about you. How old were you?
Uh-huh. Oh, gosh, what, 20?
That's so much fun.
Oh, I'll tell you more stories about that later. There's
All
a
right.
lot. A lot of fun stories.
I can't wait to hear. Okay, so we're going to really focus on this conversation. We're going to focus on chapters 4, 5, and 6 a little bit more deeply, but we're going to talk just a bit about 1 through 3 first all together, because we're going to talk more about those on our actual podcast. So we think, or the question that's going to help us today is, what do teachers need to know about students' reading skills? And we know that when we're talking about skills, we're talking about foundational skills. We're talking about teaching decoding and teaching, systematic phonics.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's really key in what the story we read, right, is that once we get to secondary, there's kind of that assumption that the students already have those skills. Mm-hmm. Or even not the assumption that they have the skills, but there's no place for it to be taught, right? That's just, it should have been taught in, K through 2, maybe caught in 3rd, 4th if they didn't get it. And so, you're really just kind of focused in on the comprehension. And like they said with Andrew, right, he could comprehend just fine. He could understand if you read it out loud to him, but it was those other skills that he was missing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that that's the struggle is, when do you teach it? And not just when, but how do you teach it? And that's what I think they outline in the later part of the book that we'll get to in a moment. But, James and Diane do assert that it's really important to know students' reading skills, not just a general score. So really know what they can do and what they are struggling with, very intimately. Like, know those things so that you can remediate what their needs are, rather than just like a general gloss over, this is their score, their, whatever. And instead of being general, you can get very specific and then make your intervention very specific.
Exactly. Right. So this is chapter 4 now, right? We're in chapter 4. That's their first recommendation in chapter 4.
Oh, I hear you. I'm sorry. I'm looking at your numbers over here. I see what you did.
But that's great. Let's just jump into it. I think that's right. I think we're ready for it.
It's our notes it's the way, there's a lot of numbers because they number their things. Yeah. We're following an outline, but the way that they number things in I was getting confused with the numbers in the chapters. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know. There's lots of numbers. It's okay.
Thanks for keeping me straight. This is why I'm doing reading, not math. Okay.
What I love about that, though, that you said is the second recommendation they had in that is to have students read it out loud to you. Mm-hmm. And I think that's so. I made a little note because one of my friends started as an interventionist this year in secondary, and she kept asking me what she was looking for an assessment, like you're talking about, right? So what's an assessment so I can know exactly where they are and what's going on. But she wanted I'm not blaming her for this, but what we're used to is something on the computer, something that's going to spit out some data for me, right? Like that kind of thing. And I was like, you need to hear them read. There might be other things that are helpful too. I'm not saying they aren't, but at some point you have to hear the students read, maybe as a part of the assessment, maybe in addition if the assessment doesn't do that. But I love their tip there of like, have them read aloud to you. You will learn so much as a teacher to hear, are they reading quickly, slowly? Are they stumbling on words expressively? Like, you can just learn so much by hearing them read out loud.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's so interesting because when I chat with parents about this, I share things like, what the way that your student or your child reads aloud is how they're reading in their head.
Right.
So if it's really choppy and
they're taking time to sound out the words.
Yeah, then that's exactly how they're reading inside their brain. So them reading aloud is like your microscope.
Your window.
Yeah, your window into their brain. Yeah. Your little microscope, your telescope into their brain. And
that's what I was like, it's, if you're doing an assessment where you don't get to hear them read out loud, if it's on a computer or something like that, then you have to like make inferences about why they chose whatever they did. I don't have an assessment in mind, but you know what I'm saying? Like if it's multiple choice, like you don't know why they chose A over C. You don't know if it's comprehension. You don't know if the fluency got in the way of the comprehension or if it was really the comprehension that was the issue,
Exactly. Yeah. So listen to kids read aloud. That's super important. And take notes about what you're hearing about their, what they're doing well and where they're struggling.
Yep. And I think it's important they added on to that too is, don't just stop at a fluency assessment where you get to just hear the words read aloud, but make sure you're also checking their understanding of what they've read, because we also have the opposite problem, which is students who are really good at just reading words out loud and they sound very fluent, but then when you ask them questions, then they might not understand what they've read.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I love how in the book, which, if you have this book and it's on page 74, it notes, so one reason for this may be lack of fluency. Decoding is so effortful that they have little working memory left over to process meaning. Another reason might be related to vocabulary. Sometimes there's too many words on the page that they're not sure of or they don't know. So asking them what a particular word means or asking them to rephrase a sentence can be helpful for them to think more carefully. Absolutely. Oh, this was, what? I really liked this next part though. Do you want to talk about this next part of the highlighting I have it highlighted.
I don't know what you highlighted.
Okay. I'll talk about
I was ready and waiting for your highlighted parts.
I noted in the notes. I highlighted a whole bunch here. Okay. I'll read it and then I'd love to hear your reaction. Okay. A critical element that enables students to understand texts is whether they are able to connect pronouns with their reference. Am I saying that right? Reference?
I think I'm trying to find where you are. Sorry.
Reference?
I think it's reference.
Reference.
Which number are you on?
Oh, we should have looked this up beforehand. I said it in my head. I did that thing where I said it in my head as I was reading silently.
I think it's reference.
Reference. Okay, I'll read it again, and maybe we cut this part out because there was a large pause before that. A critical element that enables students to understand texts is whether they are able to connect pronouns with their referents. Asking the student whom he or it refers to can reveal quite alarming gaps in their comprehension. Ooh, isn't that so good?
Yeah.
Because that's very confusing, especially in complex texts.
I remember that specifically. I had an honors class once in high school, and they were reading The Great Gatsby. Mm-hmm. And I mean, these kids were good readers, right? It was an honors class. They were good readers, but they actually pointed that out. But they were aware enough to point out what was getting in the way, but they were like, I just don't ever know who they're talking about. like I can't follow it enough to know who they're referring to. Mm-hmm.
I feel that. Yeah. I feel that way when I read text like that as well.
When there's just so many characters and you're like, wait, is the he this person or this person? And
right. Because you have to use a good reading strategy. You have to pause and say, okay, who is he referring to?
Right.
And keep that in your brain.
And keep track of everybody.
Yes. Which is hard to do if you're focusing on.
It's really hard to do if you're still focusing on just what do these words say?
What do these words say? Yeah. How to say the words versus what the words mean.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. I loved that. I thought that was really, really important to know for our secondary teachers especially.
Yeah, because I mean the texts just get more and more complex, right? So there's more and more of that kind of confusion.
Yeah, that was a good one.
Absolutely.
All right. So these next two pieces in chapter 4, these next two ideas in chapter 4, how about I read them both and then we can talk about them together?
Yep.
Yep. So pair students with an able buddy and set ground rules for a safe climate. And we're still on pages 74 and 75. We haven't gone far.
That's okay though. It actually reminded me so much of Lorraine and Lindsay's episode with fluency. So you guys have to go back and listen to that if you haven't. But Lindsay talks a lot about in her classroom. Lindsay Kemeny is a teacher we've had on a couple of times. And she talks about how she does just this, right? Is pairing. She does more like they're closer together, I believe, in their like where they are with their reading.
Yes.
But it's still it's the same idea, and especially the ground rules for the safe climate, right? Like have a pair and make it really specific about why these two are paired together, and then be very specific about how they can help each other, right? Like Lindsay has very, very clear rules about what happens when your partner gets stuck on a word. And I think that's
she even made a video to help students, like if they forget, she doesn't have to be in the group for them to move forward. They have like a minute or so video that they can reference.
Yeah. And I mean, she's a second grade teacher, right? But
yeah, but I could see high school teachers doing that too. Totally.
Right. I was going to say it might be for very different reasons too, right? In second grade, your students might not know what to do. Like I don't know how to help this person. But in high school or even in middle school, I think it's important too, because that can cause some conflict, right? Especially like students can feel like these are skills they should know already. And if you, my partner, are saying, that I said a word wrong, there can be some tension there. And so I think it's really important to set that safe climate, like they say, of like, we're all here to help each other, and here's how you're going to help each other through it. And like make it normal, right? Like your partner's probably going to make some mistakes while they're reading. That's normal. We're going to help each other through it.
Yeah. I like to, it's funny that they mentioned football in the beginning of the book. Because when I work with kids, I like to kind of connect it to sports. Like, the first time that you strike a soccer ball or a football, you're not going to strike it the best. You're going to need some feedback, and you're going to need lots of practice. And, I think if you can connect it to not just sports, but anything and make that learning messy and normalize that, and then support students, giving them the language to work through that. I think it really does set the ground rules for a safe place for all kids to learn. And again, I think connecting it to things that they do outside of school really does normalize that for them.
Yeah. I used to
especially secondary teachers.
Yeah. Because I'd say, you still go to basketball practice and you probably still do like dribbling drills, right? Like I know you already know how to do that, but you still practice it to get better.
Yeah. It's not like once you're on the NBA team, they stop practicing.
Right. They're still just practicing how to shoot the ball.
Yeah, for sure. I love that.
All right. So our next set of, I think I grouped a ton together so we can just kind of see where this goes. But I
have a lot of highlighting. No worries.
I think these were more in the language comprehension, which is why I put them all together and things. I think it's really important to know, yes, some of our students definitely are coming in with some needs in those foundational skills and need to, we have to get them reading fluently or that's going to continue to be a struggle. But knowing too that you can't forget about the language comprehension and continuing to build it up, and maybe also they might need a little extra help with it too. So they talk about vocabulary in two different ways. So building up their spoken vocabulary and also in print, which I thought was an interesting distinction.
I think so too. And they said reading represents spoken language. So if students don't know the word on the page in their spoken vocabulary, then they're going to have trouble decoding it, and then even more so understanding it.
Absolutely.
Perfect sense, right?
But then on the other end of that, they say, you can't only stick to spoken vocabulary, because think about the books you read in secondary and how many words are in those books that are just not
never said out loud.
No.
Key point. When I don't know. Maybe we should leave that in from earlier. I said we should edit it out.
Maybe we should leave it in.
Yeah. Well, we can. I'll I'll know this podcast is a safe place and no one is going to think less of me. Reference, is that how we're choosing to say it? Because it's refers.
I believe so, and we still might be wrong.
I might be wrong. We'll look it up. But I've said it in my head multiple times while reading this book. I feel like it's akin to saying names when you're reading. You know, like if you just have ways that you pronounce it.
Yeah.
Like I read Harry Potter and pronounced Hermione wrong the whole time in my head. But then I didn't know that. I didn't know.
Said Hermione?
Yeah, I did. I didn't know.
I did as first.
I mean, a long time ago, but I didn't know. And so I didn't ever have to say it out loud. And then it's the same idea.
Yeah.
Anyway, go ahead.
Well, no, I think it's a really good point that they bring up with the, you know, I almost think it would be good to make that distinction for students and let them know that, like, you know, because I'm just like flipping through a book I have right now that I have circled words, you know, of vocabulary words, and words like ravine, gullies, you know, like I just like they might use those words in their spoken vocabulary. But
it's a very specific setting for that, right?
Exactly. like highly unlikely that they're using that regularly in their spoken vocabulary. So I think it would be good for secondary students to know that, just that, like,
completely,
you know, there might be words here that you might not use all the time. That's okay. But we have to know them.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's really important. And I think that also shows respect for our secondary students.
For sure. Yeah.
Awesome. So I love this next piece because it's so easy, but sometimes overlooked. Plan to include reading in all lessons. Mm-hmm. Oh, did you want me to say that now, Melissa, or did you want me to keep going
great.
with
you're
11?
Great.
Okay. Plan to include reading in all lessons. Like, yes, definitely include reading in all lessons. But sometimes, I mean, I noticed this when granted, it was my first couple years of teaching, but I sometimes didn't have students read too much during my class. And I remember thinking, oh gosh, we need to be reading more next time. And so that was a very easy tweak to make, as long as, you know, again, we're reading the right things. We're reading some complex text and, you know, building knowledge on topics. We're not just all over the place. But yeah, to include reading in all lessons. It's a pretty simple outcome there.
Yeah. I'm wondering though, how you define that. Are you thinking just the English teacher?
Oh, yeah. No, everyone should be reading.
I remember, so we actually, in Baltimore, when we were doing our work with secondary teachers and how to, this is the work we were doing. How do you help secondary students who are coming in reading behind? And we had, Tim Shanahan actually came in and helped us a little bit. And one of the things he was adamant about was you cannot expect to improve students' reading only in the English class, right? They're like,
right. That's like 42 minutes or whatever.
Right.
An hour a day.
An hour if you're lucky.
And then how many, like
90 minutes
really,
if
how long are you
really
reading
lucky.
in that? And how long are you reading in that? Like if you sat down and thought, like, how much time am I actually reading during this time?
Yeah. So he was adamant that in some way, shape, or form, we had throughout a school day, we need to be looking at how much are they reading throughout a school day. And like really reading, not just having a textbook in front of them and answering some questions.
Right.
But like reading. So
reading
that's a whole podcast right there.
That really is.
We'll come back to it at another time.
We will. And we'll also, to share a teaser, we will talk to our Baltimore teachers who did that work. So, you know, we'll be able to learn from them and with them.
But just to be fair, they focused on their English class because they're all English teachers. Well, the ones we're talking to are English teachers.
We can explore that question further out after we talk to the English teachers.
Yeah, they had to do what was within their control.
Yes, control the controllables.
Exactly. So I skipped a little bit, if that's okay with you. Down to number, which one is it? I see our numbers are off of the ones that are in the book. I messed that up. Numbers 12, 13 in the book.
Okay. We also should say these things, they give tips in chapter 4 for helping struggling readers in the secondary classroom. And these are all numbered. We probably should have said that sooner.
Yeah. That's the numbers we're talking about, not just the ones on our own outline, but the ones that are actually in the book. So pages 79.
We're going to make a lot of mental notes for what to do next time
and
with the book club.
Yep.
Yeah.
We'll be more organized next time. But on page 79 and 80, they talk about just including regular daily spelling practice in your routines and adding systematic language teaching, including syntax, morphology, and etymology. So I think those are things that are not often thought about at the secondary level. Sometimes, especially the like morphology, potentially. But I think...
But it gives some really great ways to approach it and also methods that have some limitations. So
Yep.
you can read and decide on your own
how best it could fit.
How to best choose how to support your students based on different methods that they're sharing, which ones have limitations and which ones may be best for your secondary students.
Absolutely.
I like that too.
Yeah. And the last one I really picked out was maybe our favorite one, of course, is don't forget about comprehension, which I love that they pointed out the background knowledge.
As the number one. It's number one. Background knowledge. Well, not number one. It's the first bullet point is what I should say. Background knowledge, building knowledge is the first bullet point. So,
absolutely.
We know that knowledge is essential for drawing conclusions, picking up inferences. Love it. I'm going to can I read the example?
Absolutely.
If a student doesn't know that Venus is a very hot planet, he or she is not going to pick up on the implied meanings in an advertising slogan such as hotter than Mercury, cooler than Venus. Further, if he or she doesn't know that Venus is the seductive goddess of love, she won't pick up on the play of words between science and mythology. You might even form a misconception, gaining the mistaken impression that Venus is a cool planet while Mercury is hot. In fact, they're both very hot. Makes me think of the song.
It's so funny. When you first read it, I was like, wait, is Venus a cool planet or a hot planet?
Yeah.
I was like, I feel like there might be a mistake in here. And then I was like, oh, okay, now I get it. They're both hot. I don't know that I really knew that. I'm not going to lie.
Well, now I'm understanding the I don't know how old that song is. You know what I'm talking about?
Your
desire. Yeah. Like, I'm your Venus.
Yep.
I'm your fire. Your desire. I mean, I can't sing it all, but that
was it.
I'm understanding that even more now after reading that. So but I did not pick up on that. The implied meaning, right? In the advertising that song has been in commercials and lots of stuff.
Right. But yeah, I may have missed that for sure. Which we all have those when we're reading, right? Things that we kind of miss. And sometimes it really affects the meaning, sometimes it doesn't. But, the more that our students know and don't miss the meaning of it, the better.
Yes. And the more they know, then the more that they can hook onto that knowledge and understand more deeply. So
absolutely.
Love that.
Well, do you want to talk a little bit about chapter 6 before we go?
Yes. A quick hit on chapter 6. Chapter 6 is titled, What Does It Take for Effective Reading Intervention at Secondary School?
Yeah.
Again, we're in England.
Very fancy.
So cute.
So for me, the difference between these two were like the first one that we talked about, chapter 4, was more about the kinds of things teachers are doing in their classrooms. And chapter 6 was more about if you're going to be doing an intervention school-wide, what are some things that need to be in place so that it is effective, right? And so this is more systemic, bigger than just one teacher trying to make something happen in their class.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So do we want to go a little bit into each one? We'll just go briefly into each one.
Yeah, the problems that
problems
often
with interventions
happen.
And why they often don't seem to work.
Yep.
So the first problem is low expectations. And this just reminds me of the TNTP study where teachers having high expectations is critical. Like that is a critical piece. And we'll link that in our show notes, but it's called the opportunity myth. And that's a really important thing, that teachers have high expectations. In fact, I was able to just put some recommendations forth for Presley for next year, not naming a teacher, but her school does this great thing where they have you, email and share attributes of a teacher who you think might be a great fit for your child. And
That's
so that
nice.
was, I know, I loved that. I thought it was really good. And I feel like I'm always like saying things that are like negative about the county in general with their curriculum. So I wanted to name something really, really that like I felt like so engaged as a parent and excited to share and do. So they, you know, they asked for attributes of teachers who might connect well with your child. And that was one of the things I said is like one of the number one things, high expectations. Like I just think that we can all rise to that when, think about, you know, when we've had a teacher who's expected so much of us, we're like, oh, I need to do this.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it's a really important work. So
Yeah.
you know, they're with that person every day. And I just, that high expectations is so critical. And especially with interventions, you know, we don't want someone to think or those secondary, all kids
Like,
know, but
they're just
secondary
never
kids
gonna
can
get
read
this.
that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I think one of the lines in here that I picked out was, it says, another reason that we expect little from interventions is that we assume that the children in them are suffering from a disability of some kind. Basically, like, we don't think this intervention will work because it's because they have a disability, which I find so interesting because I will say I struggled with IEPs a lot when I was a teacher because it always just said like other learning disorder. And I was like, what is that? Like, what is this other that you all speak of?
Yeah.
And
how are we coding everything as other?
Yeah. And I frankly, like, I'm not going to say that not every, I can't say every student that has an IEP doesn't have some kind of learning disability. There might be some, but I don't believe that all students, I think some of them just are struggling readers. And if we could get them what they need, I don't think we would label them as having other learning disability. And so I think that sometimes I think can be harmful because I think a lot of teachers see the IEP, they see learning disability, and they just think, okay, like, I'll do what I can, but they might not ever be where they need to be.
Right.
That's
so
hard.
that having that high expectation, like, yes, we are going to get this child. Like, we are going to work together.
No matter what, right?
Yep.
If you have an IEP or you don't, let's do this.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yep.
All
So
right.
to that end, the problem with interventions could be a lack of fidelity. And so keeping fidelity to the program is really important because it's systematic and teachers need training to that as well. So
Thank
teacher
you for
training
bringing
is
it up. Yep.
really important. We can't expect teachers to uphold fidelity without the training to do so.
Yep. And Diane brings this up a couple times in our episode where she says like, as a teacher, if you have the training, once you have the training, it's really important not to just like go with your gut and say, well, I think that they need X, Y, or Z. Like if there is a systematic way to do it, make sure that you're sticking with that systematic way.
Yeah. And I think it's important too, that once we get rolling, that we don't have that Dunning-Kruger effect that they talk about in the book, which is that we feel confident we've mastered something because we're such novices that we don't know how much we have to learn or still to learn. And that the early successes can convince us that we know enough to, I think they say, tinker. And this can lead to negative consequences. So I was thinking, we don't know what we don't know, and we need to stick to the program.
Yep. Absolutely.
Very important.
I really like the next one, which was, they titled it Lack of Sophistication, which I think is a very fancy way of saying it, but I think it's really interesting because I think it's true. I think in secondary, often the interventions it's one part of reading, usually. Correct. It's like, oh, you have a vocabulary intervention, or we're doing a comprehension intervention, or a fluency intervention. And in most cases, students don't need just one of those things. So I thought that was really interesting to think about because, the programs I could think of, a lot of them do fall into that bucket. And like, well, are you going to actually do all 5 different interventions with a student? There's no way. So how can you look for interventions that might be able to meet all of those needs versus just one?
Yeah, and I'll name the 5 areas that they said that struggling adolescent readers need support in. And then they also give the caveat with possibly addition of phonics if assessment denotes need. So those areas are vocabulary, fluency, word study, comprehension, and this one surprised me, but not really, motivation. for a secondary student. And then that additional one may be phonics if they show that they need that.
Yeah.
So we don't want to focus on one area, right? They said that was no good. We want to focus on all of those areas. And that also feels overwhelming, right? If I'm if I'm a secondary teacher listening, oh my gosh, okay, well, just saying they might need help in vocabulary seems a lot easier than saying I have to address vocabulary, fluency, word study comprehension, motivation, possibly also phonics in time that I don't have. So, I mean, this speaks to like a bigger piece, right? Like schools have to be doing this and working with teachers. There needs to be probably a special block for this. This cannot be done like by the classroom teacher during like English language arts time. I think we just need to name that.
Yes. Thank you for naming it. Yeah. And that gets to my like one that I always bring up, which is the good old, well, if they just find a really good book, then, you're going to change their lives. And, that hits on the motivation, right? Like maybe you will get them to find one book or an author that they really love. And that's great. But that doesn't mean necessarily that you're helping them with their fluency that they really need support in, right? Or their vocabulary that really needs to be built up, because maybe that book that they chose doesn't have tough out vocabulary that's going to challenge them.
Right.
Might be why they're motivated to read it. So that's only addressing that one piece. So it doesn't really get to the whole picture.
Exactly. Can we skip down to the impact of ineffective interventions on students?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that the compounding effects on mental health, confidence, and self-esteem, that really just made me think of our episode with Stephen Dykstra. I was thinking, if anybody, as they're listening to this, wants to learn more, that episode with Stephen, it was our 100th episode.
Yeah.
It really spoke to the way that not being able to read just compounds on students daily, and how it's trauma every day, and then how it's just ongoing, it's frequent, it's repetitive, and it impacts them.
Yeah. And my thinking was like, imagine if all these other things aren't going well, right? You place a student in intervention with good intentions, but there's low expectations and you're only focusing on vocabulary, right? And you don't have great assessments, so you don't really know where they are. And, you didn't train the teachers very well. You have all these things going on. Like, imagine the impact on the student there, right? Mm-hmm. They're already probably having some of that repetitive trauma from years before, because they didn't get to 6th grade and suddenly now they're struggling, but they didn't in the grades before, right? This has been ongoing for them. And so, already being in an intervention, if they're seeing these other things happening where it's not a successful place for them, it can be really tough.
Yeah. And that's where I think I kind of reverse the order here for us to talk about it, because I think that entry point gives a lot of thinking about that as an entry point gives educators, instead of blaming themselves, they can think about how they're helping the students. Because I think every educator wants to help students.
For sure.
Right? That's why we all became teachers.
Yeah.
But one of the things that James and Diane note as, not a problem with an intervention is the insufficient quality of assessment. Mm-hmm. And more so the assumptions and intuitions, like using assumptions and intuitions rather than data.
Right.
So we would not want to use professional judgment to say, okay, this student has mastered this and now they can go on to that. We want to have the data show and say that, and then move the student, because the data says that they are able to do it. It has really not much to do with us, other than that we're providing this very systematic approach.
Yep.
And so we need to see if the student has learned it through the data.
Yeah. And I would add on to that, I was thinking of some of the data we used to see in Baltimore, which was, you would get a grade level for a student. And so, from that, you could probably say, okay, if they're in 7th grade and they're reading on the 3rd grade level, they probably do need an intervention of some kind. But that often didn't tell
Which
you
one?
Exactly. It didn't tell you where they need support. And that's where it's really necessary, if you're going to do an intervention, not to just give teachers a list of, okay, here are your kids who are below grade level. Have fun, go, right? But they need to know specifically, where are our students and what, where are their strengths and where do they need more support, specifically in vocabulary and fluency, and do they need extra phonics support? What do they need that support in?
Exactly. So that's a great way to transition us. What is required for effective reading intervention? And at the end of the book, at the end of chapter 6, we have some attention to that question. So I think it would be most helpful, Melissa, if we probably just rack these off like a little list. And I'll start the 5 strands of reading. We talked about those earlier. Phonics knowledge, vocabulary, background knowledge, comprehension, explicit language teaching, such as, for example, word study, plus motivation.
Yep. The detailed assessment that we already talked about.
Stages of learning. So they talk a little bit about that and explain what that looks like in the book, that we teach, we practice, and then we go to mastery.
Yeah. And then it's attention to sub-skills, which this is where having really good training in reading is really helpful.
It's really helpful.
Because, we can say, okay, even like we said, great, they need help with fluency. Okay, but there's different parts of fluency. And do they need to read slower, faster? Do they need to read with expression? Like what are the different things within there that they actually need support in? And
exactly.
Fluency is actually an easy one to rattle that off with. When you get to like phonics, there's a whole lot more under those sub-skills that you need to know a lot about.
Yes. Yep. And carefully calibrated steps in learning. So I'm going to pull my book to explain that one a little bit better. If you're listening and you have the book, it's on page 122.
Yeah. And I can just chat while you find it real quick is, you know, just knowing exactly like what's the right next step for students, knowing where they are in their curriculum, in their classroom, where they are with their needs based on those assessments, and like, what's the right next step it's a tough thing to know.
Yeah. And I think this sums it up, that the amount of new information presented must be small enough that mastery could probably be induced in a few minutes. So we want students to feel like they're getting it very quickly, to have some small wins. Like I'm hearing that as, I'm explicitly teaching this for small wins. So and over time, lots of small wins means really bigger gains, right?
Yeah. And I will say real quick, James and Diane talk a lot about that as the motivation for our secondary students. And although, that story we read at the beginning, we reference it in the podcast with them too, yes, Diane needed to get that student to read about football at first because she just needed a way to get him to say, okay, I'll work with you, right? But that wasn't the real motivation ongoing, right? She didn't need to like only continue to have him read about football. That was just a way to get him hooked in. But then the real motivation came from what you're saying there, which is them seeing quick gains, like, oh, I can get this and I can get better quickly. And them knowing it, right? So it's not like, sometimes I feel like in school, like kids go a really long time and don't necessarily even know, like, am I doing well? Am I not? Am I making progress? Right. So being able to tell them right away, like you went from 100 words per minute to 120, like okay. Like there's motivation there then.
Yeah, you're right. They do talk about that quite a bit. And it is, they give very good examples. It's very helpful to conceptualize that part.
Yeah. And I think it's great.
Also super motivating for kids.
Yeah. Because I don't think we always, when we hear motivation, I think we often think about the types of texts they're reading, the topics.
Or content, rather than like, hey, that might motivate, like data might motivate them.
Yeah. Or just feeling successful, right? Like feeling like I can do this. If they've felt for years like this is something they're not good at, to feel like, oh, I can get good at this. It'd be like me going to play basketball and actually getting a little better at it. It might motivate me to do it.
Yeah. Well, and I also have to say, I don't think that, some of these, there are quick wins. Like, for example, you said with fluency, like that doesn't take a long time for kids to see their improvement. Like, and I also think, like we said earlier, when we normalize, when we don't understand a word, the thing to do as good readers is to say, oh, I don't understand this word. I need to go back and break it down and then think about what it might mean in a sentence and reread. Like I'm going to spend extra time instead of, I think when readers get to the point of feeling, quote, like they're not so good, they think they need to just go through quickly to just keep going, right? Because that's what they have in their head as good readers do. Yeah. But good readers actually stop, they reread, they break it down, they pause, they think, do I understand this? what about this word feels tricky? What looks tricky? What sounds tricky? What can I connect this to? Is there, and they kind of play around with it a bit, but that takes teaching. I mean, you have to explicitly teach that and say that. So, I think there are some quick wins here. Other ones are a little bit longer term wins.
I was going to say the other side of what you just said, the long-term side of that is, building their vocabulary so that, they don't have to stop so often to really think about the meaning of words, right? If it becomes a part of their long-term vocabulary, but that's a longer term win, right? That's not a quick one.
Yeah. Well, this was so much fun. Our first book talk. We learned a lot. We hope that everybody listening learned a lot.
I hope so too. Yeah. And enjoy listening to James and Diane talk about the book on our podcast episode.
Yeah. Coming up. Thanks for listening, literacy lovers. We release a new podcast episode every Friday and share more resources in a newsletter on Tuesday. Sign up for our newsletter at literacypodcast.com. Each week, you'll receive important information, resources, and connected content.
We're excited to create a space for community discussion about our podcast. We want to connect with our listeners and support you in answering your questions. But we also realize there are a lot of other educators out there who have great advice and experience too. Let's keep learning together in our Melissa and Lori Love Literacy Podcast Facebook group, and be sure to follow us on Instagram and Twitter.
If the content in this episode helped you, share with a fellow educator and teacher friend. Our literacy lover community welcomes educators at every stage of their learning journey. We're so glad you're here to learn with us.